Everything old is new again. America's entertainment pop culture talk show.
It may well possess a rudimentary intelligence.
I'm trying to think, but nothing happens.
Felt a great disturbance in the force.
Hello, I'm Mr. Red.
Come on, Mark, like a job for me.
Where's the goodies?
Leave the gun. Take the cannoli.
I bet you wouldn't have done anything like this if Mom and Dad were here.
You filthy criminal.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
Go ahead. Make my day.
Here are your hosts, Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
I've got to ask you a question. I'll probably get a no for, but I'm just playing a hunch. Do you ever hit home runs?
Sometimes.
Do you play for a New York team?
Yes.
Are you either Mickey Mantle or Roger Maris?
No.
Are you in love with a movie star?
Have you played several positions this year, notably catcher and left field? Are you Yogi Berra?
There we go. We're here on Everything Old is New Again, an old clip there from 1960s. What's My Line? Has some relation to what we're going to be doing to today. David Cohen, how are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
We're here
really excited about today's topic and today's guest.
Yes, so we are going to have some fun here. Listen, the bottom line is there's no baseball as of yet. We're still waiting to see if baseball is going to come back this year. So getting beyond all of that, let's kind of revel in baseball of the past. Our guest is Jon Pessah. He is a New York Times best-selling author of a prior book called The Game, which is an examination of the power brokers who built Major League Baseball into the multi-billion-dollar business it is now. And he's also a founding member of ESPN, the magazine, and he's managed the sports departments of the local paper here at Newsday and the Hartford Courant. Yogi Berra is the subject of today because he's written a book called Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask. First of all, I want to say, Jon, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming.
Douglas, thanks. I'm great to be here.
It's going to be a great show. We love talking baseball, and today, when I look at and hear about Yogi Berra and see the kids flipping their cards if they do that and having fun on the ball field and all, for today's generation, I think we could say, I'm going to argue, that he's probably the most underrated Yankee of all time. He may at one point have been the most popular Yankee since Babe Ruth, and we'll talk about that as well. That's sort of an odd juxtaposition, but I want to explore that with Jon. And before we start that, I want to just lay a little groundwork, is that Yogi Berra had 358 home runs, 282 a lifetime batting average of 285. He won 3 MVPs. He's the only baseball player in the world to have won the World Championship in the World Series 10 times, more than anyone in history. Is that a coincidence that the Yankees won 10 times with Yogi on the team?
Not at all. He averaged from 1949 to 1953, the Yankees won 5 straight World Series. In that time, he batted anywhere from 280 to 322, hit anywhere 22 to 30 home runs, 100 RBIs, and he was the best player on that team. It was the tail end of DiMaggio's career. He only hit 3 years in his last year. He hit 263. 1 year he was out for half the year. It was the beginning of Mickey Mantle's career when he couldn't stop striking out. Yogi Berra, as you said, was a multi-MVP, and he was not only a dominant hitter, but he was a terrific catcher. Defensively, he had a great arm, super quick around the plate, threw people out when they tried to bunt at third base on the sacrifice. I mean, this guy was probably the best player in the American League for the first half of the 1950s.
Is that you, David?
Yeah. Doug, I'm trying to ding in here because I want to say something. No, having some technical difficulties here. When you ask I've heard a lot of questions about Yogi Berra, but I've never heard anyone ask if he was the most underrated Yankee of all time. He's usually on the top 5, maybe 6 greatest Yankees of all time on anyone's list. So I'm not even sure what you meant by
because
that.
If you talk to somebody that's 30 and 35 and under, they're not going to tell you that Yogi Berra is a huge baseball player. I'm telling you right now.
I'll tell you what, it's more like 50 and under. And people, I mean, his persona was a big part of overshadowing what a great player he was.
So, but top 10, you got it. I mean,
well, I'm not saying he's not. I'm saying the perception is not there. The perception is not there.
I got to tell you that I mean, like many baby boomers, in New York, I grew up dreaming to follow Mickey Mantle in center field. For me, the Mount Rushmore was always, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle, unquestioned. After doing all the research for this book and after seeing how unbelievably talented and unbelievably important Yogi was, if he doesn't replace Mickey, which is hard for me to say, on Mount Rushmore, you got to put 5 up there. And the point I was about to make, where I cut myself off, was he averaged 141 games a season. This guy caught 20 to 22 doubleheaders a year, back-to-back doubleheaders in August and September, playing catcher. And when Casey Stengel was asked, why does he play Yogi Berra so much, especially since there were so many good backup catchers, he said, when I play Mr. Berra at catcher, we win World Series. It was that simple. And
David, I certainly appreciate. I don't mean to cut you off and put you down. I mean, I came out too strong there. But my point was, and I agree. I want to. The reason why I was that way is I want to agree with you. He is in the lists of the top 10. He should be, but he should be higher up. And I'm just saying, for today's perception of today's, you always see these lists and they never go back beyond what the maker of the list remembers from their own perception. They'll throw in Babe Ruth or they'll throw in Lou Gehrig just for posterity, but just because they didn't see the player play, you get this perception that they weren't there. And with Yogi, we have the additional aspect of the persona after he retired, and most people think about the Yogi-isms, which we'll talk about down the line, and his personality, and as an old-timer, but anyway, I just wanted to make that point.
Black Duck and Miller Lite and all the commercials, and when you look at Yogi, I mean, Yogi in his prime was 5'7.5", 180 pounds. When we see Yogi, especially when he comes back to the Yankees in 1999, I mean, Yogi's this little old man.
Right.
And you look at him and say, how could this guy have been a dominant baseball player? But he was. Everybody I talked to, the players who played with him and then for him, just saying you could not believe how good this guy was on the playing field.
And to do this as a catcher, too. Let me just point out one example that you've talked about in the book. In 1956, the World Series, the deciding game of that World Series against the Dodgers, Don Newcomb, a great pitcher, was pitching for the Dodgers in Ebbets Field, and Newcomb was trying to throw the ball out of the strike zone and did so. Meanwhile, Berra hit 2 home runs that way, just much like his hero Joe Medwick, was a bad ball hitter. And I think you said that Sporting News indicated and voted him baseball's toughest out. So maybe you could expand upon that a little bit.
Toughest out year after year, and the reason being that there was no place you could pitch to Yogi. If you threw the ball a foot over his head, but he thought he was going to be able to hit it that day, he hit it. And, you throw, like you were saying, Newcomb tried to waste a pitch a half a foot outside, and Yogi yanks it over the wall in Ebbets Field for a home run. And, Newcomb won 27 games that year. He was a pretty fair pitcher, and he hit 2 like that off of him in the 7th game of the World Series to win the World Series. He was just there was no book on Yogi because he would, there was an anecdote in the book where when he was playing semi-pro ball in the end of his tenure with the Navy after he comes back from Europe, and they call for a pitch out, and Yogi steps across the plate and hits a double. And the catcher turns to the umpire and said, he can't do that. I called for a pitch out. He can't do that. He goes, well, you didn't tell Yogi. And the double stood.
Now, David Cohen, you're huge on Yogi, which I appreciate. Do you have some, perspective as to what we're saying here and or a question for John from the last minute and a half here?
Oh, I have a bunch of questions.
Go right ahead.
I'm not sure where they fit into the, one of the things I always wanted to know about Yogi was when he was fired the first time as the Yankee manager. How did he feel about that? Because I know that it must have been really difficult for him.
He was absolutely devastated by that and didn't see it coming. He knew he was in a tough situation that, the thinking, the Yankees had won 3 titles. I mean, 3 pennants and 2 titles in the preceding 3 years before he took over. So it was going to be, if they win, anybody could manage the Yankees. If they lose, it was Yogi's fault. But he took a team that lost its best pitcher in Whitey Ford. People were injured all season long and aging, and we know from what happened in the next 2 years when they finished 6th and then 10th, that this was a team that was on its way to collapsing. And he brings them within 2 runs of beating the very good Cardinals team in the 7th game of the World Series. He thought he was going in to get a 2-year contract when he walked into to the owner's office 2 days after the World Series, and instead they tell him he's fired.
And we're going to take up that story in 2 seconds, right after this.
And this is pre-Steinbrenner, right? This
64.
wasn't even the Steinbrenner era.
Well, the thing is that they had decided, I mean, Ralph Houck was a backup catcher to Yogi and then was cut and sent to the minor leagues. There were a lot of rumors that Houck was always jealous about Yogi's talent and also his popularity, because Yogi was easily the most popular Yankee during this time.
And we're going to have to stop right there, John, for a second. We'll be back right after this, and everything old do again.
Talking baseball.
You're listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
The great Yogi Berra. Now, the reason they're assembled around this gentleman in the center is his name is Jack Norworth. 2 of the songs he wrote, one of them was Shine on Harvest Moon, which the other one has become a classic in their profession, Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Take me out to the ball game. Come on. Take me out to the ground. Like you love me, nothing matters. I don't care if I never.
We're back here talking baseball and having a great time with David Cohen, of course, our own Yogi himself. David, how are you doing?
Good. I'm trying to think of a Yogiism to come back with.
We'll get to those next section. That was a clip from the 60s, the Ed Sullivan Show. The Yankees were on there. Yogi Berra, Whitey Ford, Mickey Mantle, Moose Scaron singing Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Why are we doing that? Because we are here with Jon Pessah talking about Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask, a tremendous book that you've got to get your hands on, especially in this time when there's no baseball. John, we cut you off last section, just finishing up talking about how Yogi in 64 was fired for the first time, how he felt about that. He was in the office expecting a 2-year renewal of his contract and was terminated.
The plan was, I mean, Yogi went right from being a player to being a manager, which meant that he was going to manage his teammates and his friends, Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford. The plan was that, okay, we know that he doesn't have any managing experience, and Ralph, who won 3 pennants in 3 years as manager of the Yankees, was supposed to be his mentor. Instead of being his mentor, there was a steady stream of players going behind Yogi's back to Ralph Houck complaining. Houck didn't send them back to Yogi, and Houck is a major in the Army, so he understands chain of command. Instead, he lets that fester. By August, he has convinced the owners that Yogi needs to be fired. So Yogi, even though he goes to the World Series, by early August, they were already looking for a new manager. So they had already pretty much been set, and Yogi was going to get fired. It would have been interesting if he won the World Series, whether they actually would have carried that through. But the decision was made in early August that he was gone.
Unbelievable. Now, we heard a clip earlier starting the show with What's My Line. Then we heard a clip just now of Ed Sullivan's show. So he was making his way through television and through popular culture pretty significantly in the 50s and 60s and 70s. He appeared on some shows, too. So don't have a story in the book about What's My Line, but I think you may have a story for us now, a little Everything Old is New Again exclusive here about Yogi on What's My Line.
Well, I mean, I mentioned that he was on What's My Line, but I couldn't get this story in. It's a terrific story. The clip you played, he was on actually twice. In the clip you played, they guessed his name so fast that they had to fill. And Dorothy Kilgallen, one of the guests, one of the panelists says, "Isn't Mrs. Berra behind in the green room?" And they said, "Yes." And they bring her out, and Carmen Berra is a beautiful woman. And they bring her out, they introduce her, and she's kind of shy, and she goes back behind the curtain afterwards. The switchboard at CBS lights up. They get overwhelmed. And why? People were calling in and complaining because how dare Yogi bring his girlfriend to the show instead of make a fool out of his wife because they didn't believe that somebody as beautiful as Carmen Berra would marry Yogi.
That's unbelievable. And Yogi had to deal with that his whole life, even in 1947, I think it was, when he was a rookie, he was hearing himself being described as an ape. And what he, I believe, responded was,
never seen anyone hit with their face.
There we go. So that was a great clip, great quote. How did he deal with being dealt with like that for his looks all the time?
I'll tell you what, one of the things that really surprised me was how much verbal abuse Yogi got for two reasons. One was his Italian heritage, which I knew there was discrimination of every immigrant group, but I didn't know how bad it was for Italians in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, really into the 60s. And also for his looks. I mean, people called him the ape, they called him Quasimodo, they called him Nature Boy. In fact, the title of a column by Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist Arthur Daly, he was Nature Boy. Just, even people that he considered friends or people that liked him, this was just a constant. And going back to his very first season in the minors, he was getting all sorts of abuse. And of course, in the minors, the stands are really close, so he heard everything. And he'd come back after making it out, he'd come back and he'd slam the bat down. He'd be turning beet red, and his manager pulls him aside and said, "Look, you're going to get a lot of abuse. A, you're really good. B, you're Italian, and you're going to get a lot of abuse. And if you let people see that it bothers you, it's only going to get worse." So Yogi, from that day on, just made believe that it rolled off his back. But inside, he wrote an autobiography in 1960. So he's 35 years old by now. And the very first paragraph talks about this character that he doesn't recognize, a cross between Joe Palooka and Little Abner, who's supposed to be so dumb that he doesn't understand pressure, which is why he hits home runs. Goes on to talk about how ugly he is. He goes, "I don't recognize that Yogi." So this is when he's 35 years old. So yeah, he heard it all. He internalized it. He didn't let it show that it bothered him, but it absolutely bothered him his whole life.
But he had some incredible intestinal fortitude, and I think it may have come from, I'm totally guessing, that he was in World War II. He won a Purple Heart. He was there on D-Day. He was in a small boat, 36-footer, supporting the troops from the sea, and was there on the boat for 10 days and saw all of what happened there on D-Day. No one really talks about it, and I don't think he spoke about it in glowing terms. Like he kind of said in some ways that it was exciting time of his life, but it had to have been frightening, and I don't know that, that doesn't change you. Did that come across at all?
Oh, there's no question. I mean, he's 19 years old. He volunteers for a secret mission. The secret mission is to be in something called a rocket boat. It was 36 feet long, wooden hull, a slab of metal on the top, rocket launchers in the back, and 3 machine guns. And they are literally the first wave of the invasion at Normandy. And his job is to feed rockets, lobbing them up into the bluffs to get the machine gun nest. What he saw was unspeakable, and then after the battle, his job was to fish the dead and the wounded out of the water, which just boggles my mind what that must have been like. To tell you how it affected him, there's a Yogi Berra museum in Montclair, New Jersey, which is a beautiful little museum, and if anyone's ever in the area when we're back open again, they should stop in because it's a great little history. And before it opened, a veterans group came to talk to him and present him with a plaque. And they walk into the lobby from one direction, and Yogi comes in the other direction, and they meet. No words are spoken. Every one of them breaks down crying. And it's just all the memories that these men buried of what they went through and what they saw just came out in that moment, and they were just so choked up that they couldn't even talk about it. And so, yeah, I think that had a profound effect on the way he looked at the world. He was just happy to be alive. I mean, one of my best sources for this book was Carmen Berra's sister, Bonnie Morse, who still lives in St. Louis. And when I was asking her questions about, what life was like in the late 40s, after, for Yogi and Carmen, and she goes, "John, you got to remember that we had gone through a depression and we had gone through a war. If you were alive and you had a job, life was great." And I think that's really hard for us today to really kind of connect with.
Exactly, and that attitude was something that is what everybody remembers. And I'm curious, though, how it affected his relationship with Joe DiMaggio. For example, Joe DiMaggio, when they began, when Yogi was a rookie, was in the outfield, and I think it was the first game they played, or one of the first games. DiMaggio's rule basically was, if you call it, you get it. If you don't call it, I got it. And a fly ball goes out to right center. Yogi says nothing, goes for it, breaks the rule. DiMaggio catches the ball, but Yogi, falls into him, and they have a collision. And later on, unlike what happened with Mantle, which is basically the same thing, and unlike what happened with many players, DiMaggio covered for Yogi with the press, and basically was saying, well, he knows that I had a difficult time with my ankle. He knows that I'm coming off of an injury. He was just going for it, and he backed off a little bit at the end. So he really covered for Yogi. Why? And we only have a minute, so maybe we can carry this over to the next section too. But why do you think DiMaggio had that attitude right from the beginning with this rookie?
Yogi is just a really likable person. And Joe didn't make many friends. Joe was kind of aloof and kind of arrogant, and he was standoffish. And Yogi lockered next to him, and the two of them hit it off. I'm sure their Italian heritage played a part of that as well. But he just took a liking to Yogi that lasted through both of their lives. And it was really something to see, because, in that particular game, not only was it that he knocked over DiMaggio, but DiMaggio was coming back from an injury. Joe DiMaggio, by that time in his career, had been hurt so many times. He had missed 8 opening days because he was always getting hurt. And so when Yogi Berra knocks him over, everybody held their breath that Joe DiMaggio was going to get up. And Berra was scared to death that he was going to be banned, that he wouldn't be allowed to play. And DiMaggio covers for him. It was unheard of. Right. And that just kind of tells you how other players related to Yogi.
Right from the start. And we'll be back right after this. And Everything Old is New Again with David Cohen, with Douglas Viviani, and more importantly with Jon Pessah, Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask. Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask. Go to JONPESSAH.com, JONPESSAH.com, and pick up this book. It's tremendous. Here with John Billingsley, and we're talking about the Hollywood Food Coalition. John, what is this?
Well, I'm the president of the board. We serve a hot, nutritious 5-course meal to hungry men, women, and children 7 nights a week, 365 days a year. Been doing it for 33 years. We distribute clothing and shoes and blankets and backpacks and you name it. And we help people access a huge array of other services from partner groups. And if you'd be interested in making a donation, hofoco.org, $3 buys a hungry person a great 5-course meal. HOFOCO.org.
Now, back to America's entertainment pop culture talk show. Everything Old is New Again, with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
I want to tell one Yogi story before we miss it. Talked about Old Timers Day, and every year they would run a roll, all of the people that had passed during the baseball year. We're watching the thing go, and he goes like this to me, hey. And I said, yeah, Yogi, what do you want? He said, boy, I hope I don't ever see my name up there.
We're back on Everything Old is New Again. That's Reggie Jackson relating his story about Yogi at Old Timers Day. Yogi didn't want to see his name on the scroll of the screen when they announced every year who had passed away. Just fun stories about Yogi, and I'll tell you, we're having a great time here to begin with, talking about a book that we can only scratch the surface of. There's tremendous stories in here. Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask, and I'm telling you, it is a book you've got to look up. You go to JONPESSAH.com. Of course, Amazon has it as well. David Cohen, are you familiar with these Yogi-isms that exist out there? You have to be. You have any?
Oh, yeah, of course.
It ain't over till it's over. Remember that one?
Of course.
You got any there on your side?
He's talking about a restaurant. No one goes there anymore. It's too crowded.
Or if you come to a fork in the road, take it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many of them.
It gets late early out there.
He's talking about that was about Yankee Stadium at playoff time in the fall, when the shadow would start coming over Yankee Stadium, especially in the outfield. So he was referring to it being late early out there. Means it got dark before it should have.
And it's making it very difficult to pick up the baseball. Left field for the Yankee Stadium was a tough place to play.
Exactly. And it's like deja vu all over again, because we're here talking all things Yogi. And I wanted to ask, I know these Yogis may have started out as fun and maybe a mistake. Did they become more planned by him, or did they just, through his whole life, just come out as a sort of mistake in discussing things?
I think that at the very end, since they became a cottage industry, and 4 books coming out built around yogiisms that maybe he tried to come up with a couple, but most of these were organic and most of them made sense. I mean, the one about when you come to the fork in the road, take it. And there's in Montclair, there's a rock with that inscribed on it at the point where you hit that street. And what it is, it's a circular street. So it comes around. Either way you go, you're going to end up going in the right direction when you get to the next street. One of the ones I liked so much is he says, I really didn't say everything I said, which was true. Some of those were, from the press who would hear something and say, that's something that Yogi would say, and they would attribute to him. Some of them came from his best friend, Joe DiMaggio, who he knew from the time they grew up together across the street from each other when Yogi was 5 and Joe was 4.
Joe Garagiola.
Yes, Joe Garagiola. Joe was considered by Branch Rickey, who signed Joe, to be the better prospect. And in fact, Branch Rickey tells Yogi to his face that you're only going to be a AAA player after a tryout. You're only going to be a AAA player, and we want people that can go all the way. So he signs Joe Garagiola instead to a $500 bonus contract. Garagiola becomes a middling player, gets injured, retires at 28, and goes into broadcasting. Starts out as a color announcer, ends up as the host of the Today Show and the backup to Johnny Carson on the Tonight Show. And all the way through, one of the main planks of his act is stories about Yogi Berra. And in fact, Yogi was once asked, how do you feel? Because a lot of these were pretty funny. Some of them, made Yogi seem kind of dumb. And he said, "How do you feel about your best friend saying all these things?" And he goes, "Anything I can do to help Joe, I'm fine with that." So some of them weren't Yogi, but he's quoted 8 times in Bartlett's book of famous quotations.
How about that?
More than any United States president. Think about that.
David Cohen.
One of my favorites, and I don't know if he even said this anymore because I don't know, but he said something about baseball being like 90% mental and the other half is physical, something like that.
Yes, he did. There's in his second autobiography, he actually went through a whole list of ones and said, here are the ones I said, here are the ones I didn't say. That one he said. And, most of the ones that Yogi said, like, after they lose to the Pirates in 1960, a series in which they outscored them in total by about 60 runs, and they lose, on a walk-off home run in the 9th inning. And he said, we made too many wrong mistakes.
Too many wrong mistakes.
And, obviously what he meant was, when we made mistakes, they capitalized on them. Right. But, that's the way, some people are just naturally funny. And Yogi had that naturally funny gene.
John, I have another question. Being that today, actually the day we're recording this, is the commemoration of D-Day, going back to Yogi's time, what was the transition, I guess, like for him from the war back to playing baseball again? I'm sure it was similar for a lot of players who served time in the war and then came back. But can you talk a little bit about what you know, if anything, about that transition for him?
Sure. He spent 13 months in combat. D-Day was the beginning of his tour, and he ended up getting a Purple Heart. He got hit in the hand. Thankfully for him and for us as baseball fans, it didn't affect his baseball career. But he saw things. He was a machine gunner. There's a story that I found where they blew up a chateau that was an intelligence center for the Nazis, and his job was when people ran out, him and two other people manning the machine guns, when they ran out of the burning building, to gun them down. I mean, these are memories that you just don't want to have. And he talked about how when they went over and then came back on the boat, that German U-boats were sinking those kind of boats, and just laying there wondering what it would be like if a torpedo came through and exploded and flooded the boat that he was in. And when he came back, he said they interviewed him several times, and the question that just kept coming up was, were you scared? Were you afraid? Were you afraid? And he kept saying, no, I wasn't. No, I wasn't. And then he would, wrote in a book, he said, of course I was afraid. You just try to put all those things out of your mind. And I think that, that was the challenge for all of the men who came back, to just bury everything that they had seen. And, he went from there to a sub base in New London. They asked him, what do you want to do next? The war was still going. He was no longer in combat. And he asked to be in the sports and recreation department. And when he got his orders to report to a sub base, he went, me in a submarine? Are you kidding? And he got over there and discovered that, sure enough, they had basically granted his request. And he was, played sports and helped with the gear and helped clean up. And I think that those months afterwards, and he ended up playing baseball in that time, was vital for him to kind of like get his sanity back.
Talk about sanity and insanity in that locker room. There were differences in the locker room that he was in with DiMaggio versus the locker room he was in with Mantle. And for what I understand, let's talk about Mantle just for a moment. Mantle was someone that he had a good relationship with and was more or less a mentor to, and he even had an intervention or two with Mantle to try to get him to focus on baseball as opposed to the bottle. And I'm wondering how he felt about kind of failing in that intervention with a player that he respected, that he enjoyed being with, but saw some issues going on.
When Mickey comes up in 51, he's 19 years old. And he comes from Commerce, Oklahoma, population 3,000. And he comes to New York City. And he's just overwhelmed by the press, by businessmen coming at him, by the fans who were told that this was going to be the next Joe DiMaggio. And every time he struck out, he got booed. And he got booed all the time. And so Yogi kind of took him under his wing. Yogi's now a veteran of 5 seasons of multiple World Series championships, and he takes him under his wing. And he really likes the kid. Everyone was in awe of Mantle's talent, and everyone was sorry to see him shatter his knee in the 51 World Series. And Yogi tells the story about watching them cart Mickey off the field. And he sees the bone that it's literally broken and through the skin on his knee. And, they became good friends. And sure enough, they tried really hard to convince him to stop drinking. That was Mantle's way of coping with all the pressure. And there was, in the early 60s, in 1961, an intervention. A bunch of Yankees came to Yogi's house in Montclair. They tried to convince Mickey to stay there, kind of dry out, stop drinking so much. Mickey said yes. He lasted there one day, and then he went back. And Yogi didn't fail at too many things, but that was one that he was really sorry that he wasn't able to get him off the bottle.
Yeah, that was really something that affected Mantle's career and the longevity of it, and the overall statistics and contribution that he could have done, even though he was a tremendous player, could have had a smidge more going on there. We'll be back right after this on Everything Old is New Again with author Jon Pessah of Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask. Get involved with this book. JONPESSAH.com or Amazon, anywhere else selling books. Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask.
In pinstripe tradition.
This is Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
I had a lot of fun, I could tell you one, Mickey called the game in Boston. He wanted to call the game. I said, you want to call the game? Whitey was pitching. And Whitey said, okay, let him call the games and see what happens. We had a sign. When Mickey bent down, it was a fastball. If he stood straight up, it was a curveball. If he shake his glove, it was a changeup. We went for 7 innings like that. We were winning 2-0.
We're here on Everything Old is New again with David Cohen. We're also talking Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask with Jon Pessah. Having a great time sharing some stories about a real American classic, Yogi Berra, a gentleman that we all, I think, know even to this day, but maybe not, to me, appreciate what he was in life. And I think some of that comes from the fact that his persona, if I had to describe him in one word, would be fun. And sometimes when people are fun or jovial or have a smile all the time, I'm just guessing, but sometimes they're not always taken as seriously as they should be in some ways. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit because, am I right? Like his love of the game of baseball never ended, and he always described it as, well, I was just having fun out there, just as an example of that story with Mickey Mantle there.
Yeah, to finish that story, which plays right into your question, Mickey's going, why all these MVPs? Well, what makes you so important? And, he was joking, but every joke has an element of truth to it. So he said, you want to do it? Go ahead, you call the game. So he calls the game, and it's this, as Yogi left off in the 7th inning, it's 2-0, and Mantle is out there, and they come back into the dugout, and he says, "Okay, I'm done. I don't want to blow this game." And he realizes how hard it is to call a game. It's 2-0. He makes one mistake, and they could lose the game. And he said after that, he's so much more appreciated what it was like to be a catcher. I mean, the catcher is the toughest position on the field. And it's ironic that Yogi had the image of not being, for being dumb. You can't be dumb and be an excellent catcher. Once he almost ended up playing right field. Because the first 2 years that he played catcher, he wasn't a very good catcher. A lot of mechanical problems. Casey Stengel comes in and brings Bill Dickey in. Dickey, as Yogi said, learned me his experience. And for 2 hours every day after practice and spring training, Dickey works on him, and he fixes all the mechanical problems. And not only does he become a great defensive catcher, but with all those problems disappeared, Yogi had a encyclopedic mind about every game that he played in. So if their situation came up, it was like, that's right, this is how we got Al Kaline out 4 years ago with man on second in the 7th inning and Ralph Terry pitching. So this is the pitch we call. And the pitchers just absolutely relied on him. And the greatest example of that is I sat with Don Larson before an old-timers game, and we talked for a couple of hours, and he talked about that perfect game, obviously. And he said, I threw 96 pitches. Yogi called every single pitch. I didn't brush him off once. Wherever Yogi put his mitt, I hit. And I was in his zone. Yogi was in his zone. He had a huge part to do with that perfect game. It doesn't get much better than that.
Right. If there was to be, the old joke, you look up catcher in the dictionary, I would suggest you would see Yogi there. And I know Johnny Bench has got very similar statistics and is highly regarded, or at least was, of course, in his day. I would analogize them together, and Bench won championships and all of that. But I don't know, how do we place Yogi in the mantle of all catchers of all time? I mean, it's not easy to do, but he's got to be top 3. Am I wrong?
Easily in the top 3. And here's the way I look at it. You look at these statistics, and they show you a great player. One of the things we left out is Yogi averaged 24 strikeouts a season. That's a good week for Aaron Judge. And he's an excellent catcher. He's an excellent hitter. You can't strike him out. What now separates him? The guy wins 10 World Series. Nobody else no other catcher is even close. And to me, the object, everyone who plays baseball, their object is to win the last game of the season, meaning they win the World Series. And Yogi won, Derek Jeter, had a great relationship with Yogi. Hey, I've got 5 rings, and Yogi holds up, 2 hands and goes, I got one on every finger.
Right.
And Yogi didn't brag at all, but the guy won 10 World Series. And to me, that separates him.
Yeah, I mean, the difference is that it was much easier to win World Series back when Yogi was playing. There were no playoffs. There were no, 3 rounds that you had to go through to eventually win. But I think it's correct to say that while he was playing, I think he was clearly the best catcher of his time, to say the least.
Yeah, Campanella and him overlapped, and Campanella was a great player. You have to look at, the statistics. Ebbets Field was a bandbox. Yes, Yogi had the short right field porch, but it was everyone loved hitting in Ebbets Field. But they were very good friends and great catchers, both of them. But yes, I think Yogi, in his time, absolutely dominated that position. There were so many players that go on from like Sherm Lala, Gus Triandos, end up, with all-star careers who couldn't get past Yogi when he was catching with the Yankees. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you.
And the glue to so many of those teams. Now, along those lines, I have to ask, because it's so interesting that he played with 2 of the best center fielders of all time, maybe some of the best players of all time, in Mantle and DiMaggio. He had relationships with both. The book goes into a lot of different stories of behind the scenes of both. But I have to ask a different question in that, who would he have preferred to play center field in the game that he had to win? And the second question is, who was the better teammate between the two?
Yogi always said the best player he ever saw was Joe DiMaggio. And I think there was an awful lot of players of that time who looked at DiMaggio as the player that did everything right. And he made it look easy on top of it. So I think if you were going to ask Yogi, who do you want in center field for a game you got to win, he's going to say DiMaggio, and let's put Mickey in right. And, one of the interesting things is I don't think it's any shock to people that Mickey Mantle and Joe DiMaggio did not get along. DiMaggio was, especially towards the end of his career, was just tired of hearing about Mickey Mantle. And Mantle was just an astonishing physical specimen. He was the fastest player anyone had ever seen, hit the ball 500 feet from both sides of the plate. He was just amazing. But so the two men did not like each other. And something that tells you a lot about who Yogi was he was friends with both of them. And not many people were. He was able to bridge the gap. And that's the kind of teammate that Yogi was. And I think he loved being around Mickey, and he loved being around Joe. And, if he would have been forced to choose, he would have said, I like both equally. Because that's the kind of guy Yogi was.
Well, which clubhouse, put it this way, you always, hear about the clubhouse and Jeter and whoever is the leader of a particular team, and that takes the personality of that person. DiMaggio was very serious and somber and very, very rarely celebrated till the last game of the season, let's say. And Mantle was the exact opposite in the clubhouse, joking around and drinking and hanging out. So totally different vibes. Did Yogi care one way or the other what was going on around him? Did it, like, sometimes we're in an environment and our personality changes a little bit based on who we're with. Was Yogi basically who he was and kind of didn't he let other people react to him as opposed to him reacting to them?
Well, I think overall, DiMaggio was serious. A serious man, a serious player. The Yankee clubhouse during Joe DiMaggio's time was always described as somber, even though they were winning World Series all the time. That Joe was just that kind of guy. And nobody would cross Joe. Nobody would say anything bad about Joe. Nobody would do anything that would offend Joe. So the clubhouse, for the time Joe DiMaggio was there, so for Yogi's career of 1947 to 1951, was quiet, respectful. And, if Joe left, it would loosen up a little bit. But while he was in the clubhouse, and he was usually one of the last, if not last people to leave the clubhouse, it was just they would win, and you would think they would have lost. And when he left, the clubhouse took on much more of the persona of Mickey and Whitey. And Whitey Ford was just, the most fun-loving guy going. I mean, he was, and the two, Mickey and him together, the clubhouse was just a much livelier place. And yeah, I think Yogi and everybody on the team enjoyed the post-game atmosphere a lot more when Joe wasn't there.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to vacate the locker room right now as we're out of time. We've been having a great time with Jon Pessah talking Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask. Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask. Grab this book. We'll be back next week on Everything Old is New Again to continue talking with Jon Pessah. Yogi, A Life Behind the Mask on Everything Old is New Again.
In pinstripe tradition, the Yankees have a mission to get...
These days, the news is full of teen suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, bullying. It's depressing and concerning, but there is hope. WWE Intercontinental Champion Mark Merrow.
Champion Choice is a live presentation that empowers students to make positive choices and live their best life. I teach students how to live a drug-free life, prevent bullying, avoid peer pressure, and keep negative people out of their lives. We are defined by our choices. There is hope.
To schedule a Champion of Choices presentation for your school or organization, visit thinkpaz.org. That's thinkpaz.org. You've been listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's pop culture entertainment talk show. Find us on the web at everythingoldisnewagain.biz. That's .biz.
See you next week. Same bat time, same bat station.